Ms. Sinu Joseph, co-founder and managing trustee of Mythri Speaks Trust. Ma'am is a pioneer of the menstrual health movement in India and represented India in the Global Conference on Menstrual Health in the year 2015. Ms. Joseph is also a celebrated researcher and author in the field of women's health and safety, native sciences, and culture. Her works, Women and Sabarimala and Ritu Vidya, have deep societal and social impact. We are honored to have you, ma'am. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And we all are very excited to listen to you. We at Campus Law Center have been trying to invite you since 2018 when we had a debate on Sabarimala. And we are glad that finally today we are going to get a chance to listen to you. I yield the floor to you, ma'am.
Namaste. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I have a small presentation that I will share today. But before that, I just want to congratulate the organizing team for such a wonderful thought. This is a start. I see this as a start to a great many possibilities. Seemaji, thank you so much for putting this together and bringing us all, and to all the others who are part of the organizing team. Just that you have been able to envision the role of spirituality in the legal discourse. That is a great big step. And I wish you all the very best and hope to be able to work with you and contribute whatever little I know in this to future endeavors in this direction. We have heard wonderful speakers over the last 2 days and today as well. Vaidyanathanji's talk was simply amazing, and I was just closing my eyes and listening to what he spoke about dharma. Very beautifully put. And we have explored spirituality in terms of ethics, morality, and of course, dharma. My presentation will bring in another perspective, which is about the science, the inherent ancient science in the spiritual processes associated with the Hindu tradition, Hindu religion, and Hindu way of living. Yeah, okay. So I have titled my presentation as the possible legal framework to interpret the science of spirituality. We will explore 4 broad heads today. First and foremost, what is the need? Because why am I bringing in this perspective of science and spirituality? Because spirituality is generally not spoken of in that manner. We often talk of morals and ethics and values, all of which are very valid. So what is the need to bring in the perspective of science? We will explore that. Then we will go very directly into what is meant by the science of spirituality. Very specific instances and information will be shared. Then we will give some examples. So how can we use this knowledge of science and spirituality to decode certain practices? Then we will talk about the possible framework with which the legal system can use this lens of science and spirituality to perhaps interpret, understand, and go about certain specific cases. Coming to the need. In recent times, there has been a spurt in a very specific sort of cases. These cases have to do with gender equality. They are typically, come to limelight by feminist activists who are demanding equal rights for women and trying to impose this lens, this perspective on the religious practices. Just to give a few examples of what we have witnessed over the last few years, there was a case in the Madras High Court where the activists demanded that the rule of having a specific dress code in Hindu temples should be done away with. And of course, the reason they gave was that it is against the law of equality. People should be allowed to dress as they wish. That was one instance. This year itself, there was another case in Gujarat High Court, which was about putting a ban on cultural practices around menstruation by calling it taboo, by calling it something that stigmatizes women and so on. So there is this case happening. In Karnataka, in the state of Karnataka, where I'm from, we have the anti-superstition law that bans some of the age-old traditional practices, such as that of the Gola tribal community, and criminalized their methods, one of which was practicing menstrual seclusion. We have the well-known cases of the Shani Shinganapur temple and Shabarimala. And more recently, there's the news about, can women not get trained for and start becoming priests in Hindu temples? So this I see as a start of many more to come in the coming days. How do we go about these cases? When the cases are about land dispute, it's rather straightforward and can be handled. But when it brings in the perspective of certain practices, religious practices, cultural practices, certain traditions, and then when a demand is made, is the lens of equality sufficient to interpret, decode, and pass judgment on such cases? This is what we will try and understand today. And if not the lens of gender and equality and feminism, what is the inherent narrative that is already there in the Hindu Dharma, which we can tap into to understand these better? What do we mean? What do I mean when we say the science of spirituality? If you look at the Hindu religion and the spiritual process, what can we call as its absolute core essence? That is signified in the statement from the Vedas, which says, Yatha Pinde Tatha Brahmande. Yatha Brahmande Tatha Pinde. Whatever is in the Brahmand, the macrocosm, it is the very same thing that is in the Pind, which is the microcosm, which in our case is our body. So this principle can be applied to various instances to understand that whatever we look at as practices of Sanatana Dharma actually are about representing the larger spiritual ideas in a form that directly impacts the human physiology. This is a science which sees similarity in the knowledge of the higher reality, the knowledge of the Brahmand, and related it to day-to-day life through the culture and religious practices. So we did not say that religion is just about faith and trust and blind belief. Within religion, there exists very finite, very perceptible scientific principles. What exactly those principles are is what we will explore next. If some of you might remember the Ramayana series that was telecast in Doordarshan so many years ago in my childhood, the very second episode where Ram and his brothers go to the Gurukul, if you recollect, the first lesson given to Ram and his brothers in the Gurukul, it was not about Arthashastra, it was not about Krishi Vignan, it was not about running the country, it was none of that. The very first teaching was simply this: Manushya ka sharir 5 tattvon se bana hai. And then he goes on to explain what are the 5 tattva of Prithvi, Jal, Agni, Vayu, Akash. And in the third episode, where they show it like a culmination of the Gurukul teaching and Ram and his brothers have grown up, before they leave, again he goes back and he teaches about the chakras in the body. So between the Panchatattvas and the chakras, it is just to give us an indication that the entire knowledge that was taught, the basis of that was what we can call the knowledge of the Sukshma Sharira. So the whole of the Vedas, all the Shastras, the Smritis, if we have to decode it with the lens of a scientific perspective, then the science is not of the sthula, not of the gross anatomy alone, but also of the Sukshma, which is the subtle anatomy. So when we say Sukshma Vignan, what that involves, this is just to give you some highlights of what we need to look at, the direction in which we need to explore, even if we are to attempt to decode these instances through the lens of Bharatiya Jnana Parampara. So we need to understand first and foremost the basics. What are the Panchabhutas? The 5 fundamental elements from which all matter arises. Then from these, we will understand the Tridoshas, because each of the Tridoshas, as described in Ayurveda, of Vat, Pitta, and Kapha, are having the gunas, the qualities of one or more of the Panchabhutas. For example, Vata dosh is a combination of Vayu and Akash, Pitta largely of Agni, and Kapha of Prithvi and Jal. With this, we will understand the human body from the perspective of the subtle reality, the Sukshma Sharira. And that is what separates Ayurveda from modern medical science. Modern medical science has excelled in the knowledge of the sthula, of the gross anatomy. Ayurveda does, in the past, we all know that there were surgeons like Sushruta, there were practicing doctors, physicians of Ayurveda performing surgery. So yes, Ayurveda did excel in the knowledge of the Sthula Sharira, but in addition, they also excelled in the knowledge of the Sukshma Sharira. So if you take a practice in the Hindu tradition and try to decode it only through the modern medicine lens, we will fall short, because modern science does not recognize that there is a whole body of knowledge that is rooted in that which you cannot see but exists. Then we have the concept of the Pancha Pranas, the 5 pranas or the 5 vayus that operate in different parts of the body. And this understanding becomes fundamental to know and to decode how yoga, visiting a temple, various practices of brahmacharya, etc., will influence the human physiology. Without understanding prana, udana, samana, vyana, and apana, we actually will not even have a language with which to communicate these aspects. Then we have the beautiful science of chakras and nadis within the human system. And chakras, in fact, connect to the endocrine glands in the body. And if we understood chakras with this and with its connection to the endocrine glands, we can then lead the conversation through the language of endocrine glands so that modern science can also understand. So this becomes a sort of a bridge between the Sukshma and the Sthula to understand and interpret both. With the understanding of all of these aspects of the Sukshma Sharira, then when we take up study of the Hindu temple, how it is constructed and the process, that is when the subject of the Agama Shastras or the Tantra Shastra comes into play. Tantra, in its most basic definition, is a technique, that is an applied science. When you apply these sciences in a form that you can see and perceive and experience through a Hindu temple, then we have the Agama Shastra coming into play. And in the Agama Shastra, we have the rules and regulations for much of these practices, especially that which pertains to temple visits. So if we read and study only the Agama Shastra text, for example, in the case of Shabrimala, people quoted the Tantra Samuchaya, which had the rules for women's entry. But that is not the text which explains why those rules are there. To understand why, it is assumed that one should have a fundamental knowledge in the Sukshma Vijnana. And that is how, at one point, it was in Bharat. So the texts which wrote down the rules didn't necessarily write down the philosophical basis, the scientific basis for those rules. That was assumed to be understood by anyone who had been through the Gurukul way of learning. And this, unless we work to revive and reteach this, it will become very difficult to understand or interpret these matters, especially in the court of law. Now, I will concretize these further because this might be a topic that is somewhat new to a lot of people listening. So I will give 3-4 examples with which we can apply this knowledge of Sukshma Vijnan in day-to-day life to understand things better. In this slide, the picture that you see, it looks very complex. You see a lot of lines moving around. This is the prana circuitry within the body. Now, as you all know, in the English language or in law or English Western science, prana itself is not understood. But in the Bharatiya Jnana Parampara, we understand that life itself begins when prana enters a jiva, and death happens when prana leaves. So prana is that fundamental concept which we need to understand. Within the human body, prana has specific way of moving, a specific circuitry. If you look at the upper half of the body, and if you are a right-handed person, then prana goes out through your right hand. Picture the Devi Devata standing in the Varada Mudra with their right hand out. And what comes out through their palm, through the center, in the center of the palm is a minor chakra, which emits, which gives out prana. So prana comes out through the right hand. Prana enters through the left hand. From the left hand, it moves to the heart, to the region of the heart. So you can see it entering here and going to the region of the heart. And from the heart, it goes back to the right hand and out. So this is one circuit of prana going via the heart, which is where the Anahata chakra is located. The second circuit of prana is from the feet. If you are a right-handed person, again, prana goes out from your right feet, and there is a minor circuit here. So it goes to the Mooladhara chakra, which is located at the base of your spine. And from there, prana is distributed to all your lower limbs for its functionality. And then again, it goes in through the left and out via the right. With just this knowledge, if you now picture the way the design of the Indian garments are, the sari, the way it is pleated in a particular direction, it is meant to facilitate the movement of prana from the earth into the left side and further up to the Mooladhara, and from there back into the right sole of the feet. If you see the way the pallu is always put on the left shoulder with pleats, it is to facilitate the movement of prana in the upper half of the body. Similarly, the dhoti for men is designed in a similar manner. If you observe the pleats and the folding and the way it is tied, it is in order to facilitate the movement of prana in its most natural circuit. If you observe people who are Kalaripayattu performers or Bharatanatyam dancers, the way they tie the dhoti and the sari, they will tuck it in very tightly at the waist, at the Mooladhara. You have to lock the prana in at the Mooladhara, because from there is where you get the power for your lower limbs to do physical work. So even the sari that we wear today was not the way the traditional sari was. Traditionally, the lower half of the garment was same for men and women, especially those who were doing hard physical work, because that facilitates prana to Mooladhara, locks it there, and from there, your entire physical work is powered. In Kalaripayattu, they're able to make those high jumps because one of the reasons is the way in which the dressing is, the clothes are. So when we go to a temple, the purpose is that we make it as easy as possible to receive the prana from the deity where a prana pratishtha has happened. And for that, there are so many small things that you have to do to make it easier for yourself. You're not pleasing the deity. You're not doing a favor to the priest or the pandit in the temple. But if you wore a sari the correct way, if you wore the dhoti the correct way, then it becomes easier for you to receive the prana. Why do we do the Namaste Mudra? Because when we do this, we close the circuit of prana. And in a closed circuit, just like electricity, prana also flows more easily. Why do we touch the feet of elders? Because who is the person whose feet you must touch? Someone who through their sadhana has been able to raise their prana and accumulate it and you can receive prana from them if you touch the feet in the correct manner. So the right way of touching is by crossing your hands so that you form a closed circuit with that person. So electricity flows more easily from a point of high potential to low potential when it is a closed electric circuit. The same is true for prana as well. If you don't do that, you are open circuits, you're not receiving anything. And if you do it the wrong way, there could be a short circuit. You see, I have a background in instrumentation engineering, so it becomes easy for me to relate the concepts of the circuitry of prana to that of electric circuits. And there's a lot of similarity in that. So just this fundamental understanding of prana alone can teach us so much more about day-to-day practices. And when we know this, we will begin to realize that it is ridiculous to question the dress code and things like that, because they're all based in a finer understanding of the Sukshma Sharira. The second example, which is both interesting and very important, is that of the Pancha Pranas. Now, all of these things cannot be seen by the eye, right? But we can know their existence by experiencing them. And that's what I'm going to tell you now. When we talk about 5 pranas, it means each of them operate in different parts of the body and they have direction. Each of these forces have direction. So the first of these we call Pranavayu. Now remember, Pranavayu is also the name for the overall life force, which we call prana. But in this context, when we say Pranavayu, it is one of the 5 pranas. So Pranavayu here, every time you inhale or you swallow food, when things have to go into your system, it is Pranavayu, this line that takes it in. Second is the Udanavayu. If you have to exhale, if you have to burp, if you have to speak even. So right now when I'm talking, it is the Udana, because from inside it goes out. Now you will see Prana and Udana are moving into opposite directions. They are opposing forces. So what happens if both are active at the same time? This is why elders tell us don't talk while eating. Because when you're eating, to swallow food, Pranavayu is active. When you talk, for speech to happen, Udana, which is the opposite direction, is active. And if you talk while eating, you could choke because you are simultaneously activating 2 opposing forces of prana. Now, at some point, someone may argue, you can theoretically argue, we have the right to speak while eating. Well, if you don't know this, you could badly mess up for doing that. Then we have the Vyana Vayu, which is the Vayu which takes prana to all the parts of the body. The one that's moving all over is Vyana. Then we have the Samana Vayu, which is shown in the circular movement at the pit in the abdominal region. And this is where I want to remind you that almost all temples have this rule that you must go to the temple and have the darshan early in the morning on an empty stomach. That means not only should you not have eaten food before your darshan, you should have also evacuated your bowels. Your system should be empty. One of the reasons is simply this, and a lot of people have experienced this. When you go to a temple, because prana pratishta has happened there, that space is capable of influencing all your pancha pranas. If you just had food, samana vayu here will become active. Samana vayu is what starts the process of digestion in your stomach. So while the temple is trying to pull all your pranas upwards towards your higher chakras, your samana, if it is not free at that time, and if it is busy digesting food, you could have stomach upsets. I have personally experienced this in 2 temples where everyone said, no, this is just out of respect. There is nothing else to it. So had a nice lunch and went to that temple and had a terrible stomach upset. This happened to a few others also when I started explaining this. So this is the reason for the rule of going on an empty stomach to the temple. You don't want any of these to be active because the temple itself will be triggering these and activating these in a different way, about which we will talk about in a while. So that's samana. And finally, the most important for the purpose of women is the downward moving apana vayu. Just as there is a gravitational force in our environment, we don't question gravity, isn't it? We don't say, oh, we don't see it, but how do we know it exists? We know it exists because that is why all of us remain on the ground. Anything we throw up comes down. So just as our rishis said, yatha brahmande tatha pinde, if there is a gravity in the brahmanda, should there not be an equivalent in the pinda, in your body? And that equivalent gravity in your body, our rishis called it the apana vayu. Apana is the downward acting vayu, which operates in the region of your reproductive and excretory organs. Just like gravity, this vayu should always be in the downward direction. If it is blocked, if it is forced to change its direction, it will cause problems in the functions that it governs. So it will cause problems in elimination of food. It will cause problems in menstruation, because during menstruation, for the flow to happen continuously for the 3 or 4 or 5 days, throughout the day, apana vayu is active and moving in the downward direction. Just as we should not go to the temple with a stomach full of food because that will make samana active, you must not go to the temple during menstruation because apana is active. And if the temple works on the apana to either turn its direction towards the prana or trigger it further, that will manifest as severe menstrual disorders. And I have been recording testimonials from many women over the course of my work about this, and I will talk about it in a bit. But just this, understanding Pancha Pranas, will in itself decode so many of the practices associated with religion, with temple visits, which otherwise we will not at all know how to interpret, or in fact, we might give a ruling that could damage women's health, because if we only look at it from the perspective of gender equality. Now, the third example, this pertains to the case that is currently running in the Gujarat High Court, that all menstrual practices are taboo. I have written a book on this called Rutu Vidya, which is about decoding all the menstrual practices, be it menstrual seclusion or specific diet, because they're all there in Ayurveda, and this book talks about it. But just to give you a clue of the most common practice that I'm sure all of you have heard and come across, of not touching the Tulsi plant during menstruation. In fact, we have ad campaigns from people, feminists, talking about go touch the Tulsi, go touch the pickle. So what is that all about? How do we understand it? When I was doing a workshop in a village in Karnataka, the women in that village told me something very interesting. They told me that in their village, when a girl gets her first period, she is given a plant to take care of and nurture. And she is meant to water it, to talk to it, to keep it around her. And after her period is over, the elders in the family, they observe the plant. If that plant has withered away after a few weeks' time, then the rule of not touching Tulsi or any other plant during her period applies to her. But if it does not wither away, then the rule does not apply to her. For me, this was indicative of our grandmothers actually understanding and carrying out a scientific experiment, complete with observation and making notes and everything. How is it that the Tulsi plant can have an impact, or women who are menstruating can have an impact on that plant where some others don't? And that's where the concept of the Tridoshas come into play. Personally, the Tulsi in my balcony has never survived. And I have now decided that until I reach menopause, I will not even bother with it, because I feel guilty every time the poor plant dies in my presence. But my own friend, she goes near the plant, she waters it, she touches it, nothing happens. And the reason is our own body type, our own prakriti. So we have the Vata prakriti, Pitta prakriti, and Kapha prakriti. Most of us are a combination of this. For example, I am dominant in the Pitta dosha. And Pitta has the quality of Ushna, that means of heat. So your body naturally tends to have more qualities of Agni, of fire. And a sensitive plant like Tulsi can be affected by it. Menstruation is a time when Pitta is naturally dominant. So the natural dominance of Pitta plus your own Prakriti of Pitta means that you can cause the plant to go through oxidative stress because of the heat that you are giving out, and the plant will eventually wither out. But if you are of the Kapha Prakriti, which was the case for my friend, then you have the guna of Prithvi and Jal, not Agni. Prithvi and Jal, both of which are cooling in nature. So even though during menstruation your Agni, your Pitta is high, it balances out by your cooling quality, and you don't have the same impact on the Tulsi plant. Like this, for every menstrual practice which is considered a taboo, there is a deep science to it. Without understanding it, simply passing a judgment that all of this is stigmatizing to women and criminalizing the practice is something that we really need to think about. Now we will come more closer and specifically to the Sabrimala case and why we need to understand the chakras for this purpose. You see, we have around 108 chakras within the body. Chakras are junctions where several subtle nerves, which are called nadis, they're not visible to the eye. They are subtle channels which carry prana to different parts of the body. When many of these nadis come together, in those points, we have chakras. So though we have 108 chakras, the ones here in red in this picture, these are the main 7 chakras which are aligned along the spinal column. And each of these chakras, as you can see in this diagram, is connected to very specific endocrine glands in the body. So the lowest chakra, Mooladhara, is connected to the excretory organs and the reproductive organs in men. The Swadhisthana chakra is connected to the ovaries in women. The Manipuraka chakra at the navel is connected to the pancreas and the adrenal glands. The thymus in the region of the heart, that is triggered by the Anahata or the heart chakra. At the throat, we have the Vishuddhi chakra, which basically regulates your thyroid and parathyroid functions. At the space between the eyebrows, we have the Agnya chakra, which is the seat of the pituitary gland as well. And finally, we have Sahasrara. Some don't call it a chakra because it is the seat of consciousness. So you see, there is a physiology to the spiritual process. What we refer to as moksha, when that happens, there is a direct change in the human physiology where the prana as the Kundalini Shakti rises through these chakras upwards to the Sahasrara. And when it reaches here, that's when we say the state of samadhi has been reached and the person has attained moksha. So the entire process of moksha, there is a corresponding impact on the human body as well. This is very important to know. And chakras form that link between understanding the Sukshma and the Sthula Sharira via their connection to the endocrine glands. Why am I saying all this? If you look at the Agama Shastra texts, there is this drawing. They call this, it is labeled as the Manushya Devalaya. It is just a representative drawing to drive home the point that a Hindu temple is in fact, when constructed according to the Agama Shastras, built just like the human form. The entrance of the Hindu temple is considered similar to the feet of the Vastu Purusha. So the human form that is lying is called the Vastu Purusha. The genital organs is equated, the Dvajastambha is equated to the genital area, the Rangamantapa to this portion, the Antrala to the heart, and most importantly, the Agnya or the area between the eyebrows corresponds to the Garbhagriha, the main sanctum. So this diagram, you see this diagram where they have drawn the chakras, this is just to establish the point that a Hindu temple is constructed along the lines of the human body. Remember, Yatha Brahmande Tatha Pinde. That was not just a philosophical statement. That is a science, and the application of that science is the Hindu temple. So without understanding all of these, it becomes very difficult to decode the practices pertaining to religion. If you look at the Sabrimala case itself, I will now very specifically speak about it. Sabrimala had this restriction that women, regardless of whether or not they are menstruating at the time of the visit, should not enter the temple. When we spoke about Pancha Pranas, I explained how, because of apana, you should not go during menstruation. But what if you're not menstruating at the time of the visit? Then why are you not allowed to go? That's the question in Sabrimala, and in fact in other mokshadhams also. The reason is now what I will explain. I have understood this through the work of Sri Arvind Subramaniam, who is a researcher and has done tremendous work on Shasta. Shasta is a very ancient deity, an incarnation of who is Lord Ayyappa. Okay, so before Lord Ayyappa happened, there is Shasta. There was Shasta at Sabrimala, and Sabrimala itself is part of 6 temples of Shasta known as the Shat Chakra temples of Shasta. That means corresponding to each of the Shat Chakras, there is a temple of Shasta, and you must go in that order before you go to Sabrimala, and Sabrimala itself is associated with the Agnya Chakra. So I visited all the 5 temples. I did not go to Sabrimala, even though at the time of my research, the court had passed the rule that women should not go. I did not go because I understand what this means. And my book is Women in Sabrimala, which explains my journey through these temples. So as you go through each of these temples, you will actually experience the effect of how it impacts your chakra and that particular part of the body. Now, without knowing any of this, if women of reproductive age just go to Sabrimala, what could happen? When you go to Sabrimala, or in fact, most of Shiva temples, that's why Kailash and all those places are typically not for women of menstruating age. When you go to that place, it will trigger the Agnya Chakra. And Agnya Chakra will in turn trigger your pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is what starts the release of hormones for reproductive processes for both men and women. Now, there is a complex set of processes. The pituitary will release 2 hormones called LH and FSH, and through that, there is the testosterone, which is released. Up until this point, the same thing happens for men and women. But as you know, testosterone is an androgen, a male hormone, and men, if pituitary is triggered and they have a lot of testosterone released, it is actually good for the overall functionality. But in women, testosterone should be in very, very minute quantity. And in fact, your ovaries should be able to convert the testosterone into the female hormone known as estrogen. So if you go to a Devi temple, especially that is associated with fertility, how it works is that Devi temple will trigger your Swadhisthana chakra, which will produce prana that will operate your ovaries and get it to function as it should. But here you are not working on any chakra except the Agnya chakra. So pituitary is in a hyper state, it is releasing testosterone, but your ovary is not able to convert all of it because it is not operating at the same frequency as pituitary. That's why in Shiva temples, there's always a goodie for Bhagavati. If you go there, you must definitely visit Devi also to balance out this equation. Over a period of time, if women were exposed to places like Sabrimala and only their Agnya, only their pituitary is triggered, result will be that the ovaries become dysfunctional after a period of time because there isn't enough prana going here. And that's when conditions like PCOD could happen. I want to tell you that I know I'm exceeding the time limit, but this is something I wrote as a theory by understanding the knowledge of the Sukshma Vijnan. But I was utterly shocked when I got a letter from a woman who told me that when she was about 9 or 8 years old, her father took her to Sabrimala. As you know, women before menarche can go there. That is a rule currently. She had a tremendous experience when she was there during the Makara Jyoti festival. And those who have that experience, basically your physiology will become capable of attaining moksha. That's what it is. So she had that experience. And after that, when she got her first period at the age of 12 or 13, everything that I wrote about hyperandrogenism, about excess testosterone, about masculine features, all of that manifested in her. And all through her adult life, she has struggled with problems like facial hair, with PCOD, with ovarian problems. And when she read the book, she just made this correlation and she said, this is what happened. And then I began inquiring about the rule about allowing girls of even after, just before menarche, was that there traditionally. So there are some older families which have told me that no, actually women were of any age were not encouraged to go to Sabrimala. And even for menopause, it's 7 years after menopause. So I know about women who went to Sabrimala soon after menopause. And just during the yatra itself, their period started again in a very disruptive manner. So 7 years after menopause, and preferably not even before menarche, is perhaps the way the traditional rules were. But we have lost this entire system of knowledge. And therefore, the rules have also just been haphazardly modified, causing severe damage to women's health. The last slide. If all of this knowledge exists, how do we put it? Is there a possible framework for the law to understand and use these, at least in cases where it is about the religious and traditional practices of the Hindus? We can find some answers for that through the lens of Nyaya Darshana. Now, Nyaya Darshana is one of the 6 systems of philosophy of the Indian thought process. It is nothing but epistemology. That is the study of scientific inquiry. So if people are hesitant about putting this under religion or spirituality, then Nyaya Darshana is all about using logic and a scientific process to arrive at the truth. And Nyaya Darshana proposed 4 pramanas. Pramana meant the means of right knowledge. Can we use these in a framework to talk about, to understand, to interpret such cases? These pramanas are the first, Pratyaksha Pramana, direct experience. In the case of Sabrimala, the first person who told me that going to Sabrimala will affect women's reproductive health was none other than mother of the then Tantri, Srimati Devika Devi. So she and other female devotees, they know through Pratyaksha Pramana that place could impact women's health negatively. So could we have considered that? Could we have considered this as a valid pramana? Anumana and Upamana. Anumana is about inference. So much of the theory I developed, it is an inference. So my work is, I visited the 5 temples and from that inferred that Sabrimala would have such an impact. Upamana, comparison with other mokshadhams, which also have similar rules for women of this age. And if these are not sufficient, the ultimate pramana is Shabda. In the language of darshanas, Shabda refers to the works of the rishis who are able to use the techniques of yoga and go into states of samadhi. And from there, they attained this knowledge and wrote down the Vedas, the Smritis, the Shastras derived from it. So if you cannot get a Pratyaksha Pramana, if you are unable to have knowledge of the sciences, then Shabda should be your ultimate Pramana based on which you can decide. So in case of Sabrimala, we have the Tantra Samuchaya text, which clearly has written the rules for women. That should have also sufficed. In fact, if we use the lens of Pramanas, for all these cases that I have spoken of, which are about the religious and cultural practices, it would have, if this framework was in fact accepted in today's legal system, that would have probably helped the case. And that's just a thought I wanted to share for today. Thank you for the opportunity. I will stop the share here.